What's happening, Power Painter? This is Taylor Payton of TayPayArt.com and PowerPainters.org, and that is my cat, Minx. I'm trying to tell the Power Painters about the lesson that they're going to watch. Come here. Okay, so this is happening. Say hi, Minx. Say hello. This is Minx. It's one of my kitties. So, the beginner drawing course, week 9, is essentially a lesson where I will be showing you how to solve problems in your drawing. I can't do this with a kitty. Put you down. Okay, hopefully she'll be quiet. The beginner drawing course week 9 is about solving problems in your drawing. And I originally had the course as being an 8-week long course, and it has done phenomenal that way. People really enjoy it. It is definitely my most popular course on Power Painters, but I feel like there's more stuff to teach. And since it just turned 2017, I wanted to get this video out to you guys because I feel as though it'll be really helpful to know how to solve the problems you're encountering in your drawing, and that will make 2017 a really easy year to level up your craft, okay? So if you want to get the 8-week version or the 12-week version where this actual lesson comes from, those are both in the description box below if you want to acquire the beginner drawing course, whether it's 8-week or 12-week version. And yeah, I guess that's pretty much it. So I hope you enjoy the lesson and learn a lot about it. Leave me some comments below about some drawing stuff you're struggling with, and I will do my best to help you. Oh, and if you want to sign up for the Power Painters mailing list, that would also be super rad. That is in the description box too, and you get free tutorials when you do it, so do it. Um, yeah, so that's all. Anyway, have a rad time. Enjoy the lesson. It's the full lesson. I'm not holding anything back from you. It's got the assignment at the end too, and you can send me that if you want. Happy drawing, and I will see you next time I upload some stuff, and hopefully certain feline creatures will allow me to do that. Enjoy the lesson. Hello and welcome to the Beginner Drawing Course Extended Version Week 9. This chapter is entitled Problem Solving in Drawing. So if you followed the course up until this point, and I sincerely hope that you have, then I really recommend that you start to think with the principle of inversion, and we're going to learn how to do that throughout this lesson and even in the assignment at the end. So thus far, we've learned a lot in this course about what it's helpful to do, the things that we should be doing, right? And that is really good because we have all of the additive stuff, the stuff that's going to add up. That's our plus mark, that's our addition. So we're doing things like we're using our vertical lines, our diagonal lines, our horizontal lines, all that good stuff, and using those tools that we learned throughout this course in order to create things that have more of a solidity, more of a believability. However, there are numerous problems that are going to arise as you draw, and some of them are going to be pretty taxing to deal with in terms of, um, your emotional state, your mental state. It just does not make for great drawing if you don't kind of build a strong carapace between you and what it is you're doing. So instead of fighting with those things, we're simply going to avoid many of them, or at least use the principle of inversion to make solving them easier. And now the principle of inversion is basically taking a problem and flipping it on its head. So if you're looking at the darks, you would look at the lights. If you're looking at what's warm, you'd look at what's cold. If you're looking at things to do, then you would flip it and say, we're going to shift our focus on what not to do. So this week's lesson is going to be taking inspiration from the principle of inversion and making sure we know what not to do. So let's talk a little bit about that. Essentially, some things to avoid in finished work, and I say finished work because these are things that are not too terrible, honestly, when you're doing your sketch phase, when you're just starting out and figuring out your idea. But in the final presentation of stuff, we'd like to avoid some of these if we can. Now, that being said, there's nothing hard and fast. All this stuff can work in the right context. But as a general rule of thumb, we want to make sure that we're avoiding the things I'm going to talk about in finished work. So the first one is shaky, hairy, or fussy marks and lines. So as you can see, there's tons of extraneous lines, things that we just don't need in a drawing in this little quick nasty doodle example. So hairy lines are when you do stuff like this, you're like too scared to make one line, and so everything looks fuzzy or hairy. And like I said, that looks great if you're going to use it as the proper material in a drawing, but you don't want your whole contour to be full of hairy or shaky or fuzzy marks and lines. So think to avoid the shakiness or the hairiness or the fuzziness of your lines or your marks. Next, it's stiff and imbalanced poses. So this pose, while it isn't completely terrible and imbalanced, it's fairly stiff, it's pretty symmetrical, and if we're going for that, that's fine, but we're going to use this as an example later and show how we can tweak it to make it more dynamic, more interesting, and have more of a balance that we maintain during that. But a stiff pose is basically a pose where it doesn't look natural. It doesn't look like they're actually candid, or your figures are not, they're basically not coming through in a way that feels like they have a flow to them. They're imbalanced, meaning that they look like they're going to fall over, like a cardboard cutout at a movie theater. Next, there's proportion and placement issues. So this has to do a lot with anatomy, facial structure, all that stuff. And we're going to get into some of that and how we can solve those things, but we want to make sure that we're avoiding them if at all possible. But they're easy enough to fix in most cases, especially if you catch them in the early stages. So we want to catch this stuff as early as we possibly can before we start to go too far into our layer of finish. Next, there's a lack of value structure or a light source. Many times when we start noodling around and doodling, we're trying to figure out what we want to draw. Then the lack of a value structure is we don't know what kind of value structure we are going to use for our piece. Now, in this course, we talked about a value structure. There's a 2 value structure, a 3 value structure, and a 4 value structure. And I feel like that was lesson 4 or so. But yeah, it's in the lesson roster of the beginner drawing course, and those will give you some value structures you can work with. Because if you don't establish a value structure, then things can get very muddy very quickly. Next, a light source is pretty much concomitant with a value structure, meaning that if you know your values, you know how bright and dark things are going to be within the picture plane and what elements are going to be separated by how dark or light they are, then the light source is going to dictate what is in light and what is in shadow. And we got into some of that once again earlier in the course, but we will talk about it later as I use this as an example of how we can improve this drawing using the principle of inversion. Another thing you want to avoid usually is noodling. And unless you're just hanging out at a cafe with your friends and kind of doodling around and trying to find some stuff you can work with or turn into something else, then in our finished drawings, stuff that's super noodly tends to become unclear and it looks unsure because you're still drawing but you're not sure where you want to go with it, and so that is communicated in the final work, and we want to eliminate as much noodling as possible. So even while you're sketching, it's fine to do it to a degree, but once you get that solid idea down and you start to feel out where you should be going with it, then the noodling can kind of relax. You don't need to make as many marks, and you want to maintain as much clarity as possible as you move forward. Just makes cleanup easier, makes stuff look more confident, and it generally just works. So think of the word noodling like a bunch of spaghetti noodles and just throwing them all over the canvas, making a big old mess, and then you have to move those around and try and turn them into something, which is way harder than just putting it down line by line. Next, we're going to talk about tangents. So tangents are very easy to understand. If I have 2 lines and they're either not touching or they're overlapping and one of them is thicker, we don't have a tangent. Because a tangent is when 2 things are touching right next to one another. So this flattens out space, and we don't want tangents because the space will flatten out. So if you're trying to make sure that things look dimensional, like a sculptor, that they have volume, then tangents are going to create a flatness in that area. And we really want to make sure that we're not creating any areas of flatness that we don't want. It's like if you're using flats in a musical scale or in a musical composition, you want flats where they're going to fit, right? Where they're within the parameters of what you established. Anything else is going to sound off. And likewise in drawing, if you have tangents where things are flattening out, like right here, where these lines don't overlap, they just kind of touch, then you're going to have parts of flatness, and we want to avoid that if we can. So the easy way to avoid a tangent is just to make sure that lines either don't touch or they overlap, and one aspect is usually thicker in a case of overlap. Another thing we want to avoid in general is reinventing the wheel. The principles I'm laying down for you in this course are things that masters that have come before us have made sure that they took every aspect of the craft they could, the craft that is drawing, and they made sure that they solved all these problems ahead of time, and they were kind enough to build their legacy and give us the knowledge of how to deal with these things. Reinventing the wheel is, basically trying to get a whole new thing into play when all you're trying to do is solve drawing problems and make your stuff look as potent and how you want as possible. So there's no need to try and create new fundamentals or do anything super like out of the way of what the masters have laid down, simply because we're not going for abstract art in this case. We're not trying to just do art for art's sake in that sense of, oh, I just want to do this and have a feeling about it, and it's very, abstract, and everybody who looks at it will see something different, and that's fine in and of itself. But for the purposes of this course, we're not going to be reinventing the wheel. We're just going to be improving upon it if we can, and really just relying on it, because that's just wasted psychic energy, wasted mental effort if we're going to be taking what's already working and trying to find a whole new way to do that. It's just inefficient, and it will lead to a lot of frustration, which makes it less fun to draw, and we want drawing to be as fun as possible. So we won't be reinventing the wheel. We'll just be improving upon it if we can, and relying upon it if we simply want to take the most convenient and purposeful route. Let's see. So I'm going to copy this drawing over so we have a point of reference. And we're going to put a big old red X right next to this one so we know the stuff we don't want. And I'm going to keep this as a checklist. So I'm going to make it tiny, put it up in the corner, so we can refer back to this stuff as we fix up this drawing. So first and foremost, like we've done many times during this course, and it's just a good practice, I'm going to drop that opacity. I'll just scale it up a little bit, give myself a little more room to work, and we'll zoom in. So shaky, hairy, or fussy marks and lines. If we're going to go over this drawing, then I think that we'll probably start off doing a few of these just because we want to create a sketch that's going to be more pleasant to look at. So it's okay if things are a little fuzzy because we'll clean them up later. So after I've dropped the opacity, I'm going to start a new layer, and I'm going to begin sketching in with more certainty the pose. And I'm going to start off by figuring out the angle of the shoulders in relationship to the hips. So it's a fairly symmetrical pose right now, and that could be fun, but let's juxtapose them a little bit, meaning that this side over here is going to be compressing. If you ever notice somebody standing, usually they're not perfectly symmetrical because it's unnatural, it reads as stiff, and even if it's balanced, we don't usually do it unless there's purpose behind it. So we're going to go for something a little more natural, a little more dynamic. So if I'm juxtaposing the hips by using these two diagonal lines, that means that I'll have room to create something a little more dynamic and a little more natural. These aren't really exaggerated angles, but they'll work for our purposes. So let's not even start with clothes. We'll just start with a mannequin. Get sort of a rib cage shape in there. And I know my line of action is the spine, and just kind of do a bit of an S shape. It's a very subtle S shape because we're doing it pretty much head on. It's a straightforward frontal pose. Next, I'm going to box in kind of the torso, figure out where the hips would go. And then we know that if one side's higher than the other, that means that in terms of balance, that this leg would be having most of the pressure applied to it, pushing that hip up. So when one side has more weight on it, that side gets compressed, and the other side will stretch out ever so slightly. Like I said, you can really exaggerate this, but we're going to keep it pretty straightforward. So next, let's put one leg pretty close to being center line with our figure. It's really easy to see that because we're doing a frontal pose, but just to make sure, I'm going to create a perfectly straight vertical line. So this is our measurement. It's going to make sure that we remember the gravity between our figure and the ground. So a perfectly straight line gives you a reminder not only that the figure is a symmetrical, for the most part, the figure is pretty symmetrical, like it's half and half, and you can subdivide it in a lot of ways that make sense. But a straight up and down line reminds us that we have gravity and weight to consider, and it also helps us keep balance. So I don't need it quite that opaque though, so we'll drop that a little bit. So now I can measure this diagonal leg against that vertical line. Let's go ahead and establish that the leg, in very basic shape form, is underneath the figure. It's not out to the side. Next, the other leg, since one leg is closer to being directly beneath the center line of the figure, we can shoot that one out a little bit because it's going to offset the balance. I know he's looking a little sassy right now, but we'll fix that. When you draw a lot of girls and a lot of feminine poses, you can get into the habit of just using feminine poses by default, but we will make sure that things come out a little more masculine just because that would fit our vision for this figure at this point. So right now we're trying to avoid a lot of the shaky, hairy lines, so we can eliminate some of them, because then it makes our drawing clearer. Not doing too much noodling, just enough to get a feel of where we're heading. Next, we will establish where the shoulders are going to go. Now, the two hands on the hips pose, that might be what's contributing to the sassiness a little. So I'm going to let one of those arms hang down. Notice I'm getting clearer and clearer on where I'm heading with this just based on what I've already established. And this is part of the game, guys. It's just taking what was previously there, and I know I've said it before in this course, and turning it into something that is closer to your vision or what you want. You don't want to change it up too drastically in most cases, because then that's basically you might as well start over. But since we're using the same angle and a similar pose, it is going to work in our favor in this case. And remember, the shoulder is dropped a little bit because this line, which is basically the shoulder girdle, or it represents the shoulder girdle, lets us know that the hips are juxtaposed up this way and the shoulders are kind of sloping downward in this instance. You can think of it like a balance beam. This is perfectly parallel, which reads as stiff and a little boring, so we want to avoid that for the figure, which we have here. And instead, we just have these nice slight curves, meaning that our diagonals are going to give us a little more dynamism. So with that in mind, I'm going to let this arm hang down and just use some really simplistic shapes to represent where I'm going to take those things later when I do the second version of this drawing. Let's double check our list. So we're getting a more fluid and balanced pose. We're making sure we have balanced with our vertical line, and we're going to keep on working to make sure we don't have proportion and placement issues. So far we're looking okay in that category. There's probably some tweaks we can do, like the legs are definitely not perfect. This one could use a little more of a syncopation between the joints. Basically what I'm saying there is that if you were to stand up and put one leg under you, the way you shift your weight is still going to have sort of an S curve to it in the leg, and it was looking a little bit stiff. So I draw a very subtle curve within the shapes, and I figure out where the joint would go and how the bones and the muscle, which I'm not drawing in this case, just the tube forms, just the geometric primitives, would react if you're putting most of your weight on that leg. And you'd probably arch your foot out a little bit for additional balance. So if you just keep thinking to yourself balance and weight and gravity, then you're going to get a more natural pose. A great way to configure a lot of this is through life drawing, because oftentimes you can do very quick gestures and you'll know you're getting it more accurate by how balanced your figure looks. Another way to do that is just to invert your canvas or flip it, and you automatically get a more brisk idea of the proportions and the placement. And I can see that this leg now is looking a teeny bit short. I'll just drop that down a bit. And this one is not quite proportionate either. It looks like the knee's a little bit high. So we're going to try that again because we're still on our sketch phase and figure out exactly how we want that foot to read, because it's also fallen out of perspective a little bit. So we can line the knees up more or less. Get rid of some of those previous marks. Drop the opacity a little. See what we're doing. And just start to configure in a few lines how the separation of our elements is going to be working. So that's looking a little bit better. Yeah, a little more natural. Still need a bit more of a juxtaposition. Definitely the most challenging part for most artists when you're doing figures, myself included, is usually to get this weighted juxtaposition, like taking into account not only the angle of the joints and how we actually look when we're standing and shifting weight, but the aspect of gravity upon all of that. So that's a little closer to what we're looking for, but I'm still probably going to end up tweaking that later. Next, we'll go for the other shoulder. And it's cool to leave this one on the side. Just rock those tube forms a little bit more. Don't need to quite draw all the hands in yet. Again, this side is going to be a little more stretched. And this side is going to be a little more compressed because the hip's coming up, which means this side will be a little more curved, this side will be a little more straight. Because you think of the squash and stretch of the figure and how skin moves across forms. And all this stuff will come to you the more you pay attention, the more you study, the more you go to life drawing, and just listening to the principles that I am kind of giving you right now will help you to understand this in ways that will make sense as you continue to improve. And we're always getting our figures more and more balanced and more interesting to look at. But these are really good ways of using those diagonals, those horizontals, those verticals, and thinking about the things that we're trying to avoid. It's nice to have a checklist because then we can just keep referring back to it. And if that helps you when you're starting out, so you don't have to keep it all in your brain and you want to free up more of your processing power for drawing, then a checklist is not a bad idea. You can just write these down and refer back to them as you're creating. Alright, so the head's going to be the easy part. However, we are going to juxtapose it a little bit more so because we don't want it straight up and down. That would be a little bit boring. So instead, let's have them looking off to the side. So before I even started drawing again, I wanted to decide how that's going to look. Because unless I want to noodle around for a little bit until I see something in it, then if I have no purpose in my mind, my hand is going to reflect that. I'm not going to be clear on how my figure is going to look and how these parts are going to fit together. And that's something I, like I said, want to invert, want to avoid. So shot that side's a little higher, and he'll be looking off over here, maybe referring back to the one version of him that is shorter and dumpier and more symmetrical and flat and full of the stuff you shouldn't be doing. Next, since we have a pretty solid basis now, a more candid and natural figure using some of these principles as applied to figure drawing like I've shown you throughout the course and just now, we're going to just keep on checking for stuff. So for the most part, our lines are fairly clean and readable. Even if you were going to present this, people would get it. It wouldn't have a whole lot of this undue extraneous action where this stuff is just looking nasty and muddying up the form and confusing the eye. So we've avoided a lot of that, even though this is just the second iteration of the drawing. Next, we made sure the pose was not as stiff and imbalanced. So we used a vertical line to showcase how exactly a perfectly up and down y-axis would look. So we knew we could kind of bend things around that to make sure we avoided stiffness, because we used the stiffest thing possible to contrast our figure against. In terms of proportion and placement, excuse me, we're looking pretty reasonable in that area. None of this is exactly perfect because I'm doing it from imagination. However, it's still, like I said, readable and workable. And the more you study, the more you'll be able to get these proportions perfectly. And know where you can start using earmarks, like places where joints would line up with other aspects of the figure. And that's just measuring stuff against other stuff like we did with vertical and horizontal lines. So the lack of value structure light source, we haven't established any of that yet because we've been focusing on the pose. But if we wanted to decide that, we're at a great point in this drawing to say, well, the light is going to come from over here, from this upper left angle here. And then if we're going to say, okay, well, it's just a two-tone value separation, so we're just going to have light and we're going to have shadow. And I'll do this in my drawings. I will literally just make some shapes or forms, some very rudimentary geometry, and remind myself of the two-tone value separation and where the light source is coming from. This way I have a visual reference and I'm not keeping it all in my head, once again utilizing precious processing power that could be used to better the drawing. So now that we've established a simple value structure, as simple as you can possibly go, and a light source, we've avoided some noodling to a great degree in relation to this one, and we're looking out for some tangents now, and it looks like things have a pretty clear separation. Nothing's flattening out too bad. So I'd say we did all right there. And now we definitely didn't reinvent the wheel. All these methods that I showed you are things that I have picked up. The hips, the juxtaposition, the vertical line of measurement, the Andrew Loomis sort of head creation technique. All these things are bits and pieces that I've picked up from artists that were either teaching overtly or inadvertently, and I decided I wasn't going to try and, create a whole new technique. I would just adopt the techniques that I was seeing that were working for my own purposes, because what would make my art unique is the way that I solve problems and um, the way that my ideas are going to come through as I create. And that's the same with your art. So you don't need to strike out in this mission to redo everything, really. I mean, I know that seems counterintuitive when you're a creative, but see, I'm actually noodling while I'm talking here. That's great. Great example of what not to do. So I am fixing up some of this stuff though. Anyway, so you don't need to have this die-hard quest to figure out how to do every single thing yourself and invent it from the ground up, because that's just wasted and dispersed effort for things that could be much more effective, solving problems that actually are going to arise and not trying to create a whole new myriad of problems and solving the other ones. All right, so this is a fairly decent figure, and we're going to go over it one more time for the purposes of the demo. I'll just get rid of this one. So drop the opacity of our vertical line, and now we're going to do our best once again to go through the checklist and avoid all this stuff. So first and foremost, I'm just going to start from the top down and begin sketching in a head. We'll drop our brush size to maybe about 5. That should give enough nuance in our lines. Just going in and using all those shapes that I've pre-established in the second version of the drawing. Trying to keep it as succinct as possible. Not trying to make a ton of lines. Sometimes I will need to get a little sketchy just to figure out where I'm going. But for the most part, the big stuff is laid in. So the rest of it just becomes the game of configuring where you want certain stylistic choices to fall, like a hairstyle, for example. I'm always getting rid of stuff pretty quick if I'm not feeling it. No reason to hang on to it or try to make it work, because less is usually more. So if I have a whole bunch of lines and I just keep making lines on top of lines, we start going into shaky, hairy, fuzzy territory. And it even sounds unpleasant. So let's do what we can to avoid that. Just going in, calmly drawing, not rushing, getting rid of stuff as I see fit, and redoing it when necessary. Flipping the canvas too. So if our ear's there, we know the bottom of the ear lines up with the bottom of the nose. Go ahead and sketch that in. There's a pretty particular face angle, pretty particular angle for the head. So I'm going to probably redraw things a couple times until I'm satisfied with how they're going to look. Making very small, deliberate movements. Should we be happy? So as I stop to consider things, I usually stop drawing, once again to avoid noodling, especially at this stage of the game. So it's kind of a neutral expression. Like he's chill. Drawing some eyebrows. Again, fairly stylized. I'm not using any reference except for what's established on the picture plane. I'm just figuring things out as I go, but since I've given myself enough room and enough visual information, it's a pretty straightforward and succinct process from here on out. And we like processes because then, once again, our energy is channeled properly. That's why they call it information, because it's in formation. It has a certain system that allows us to focus on the things that we need to focus on, and not the elements that are going to take our attention away. If I was trying to do this level of cleanliness, this level of drawing just from the get-go, it's possible. It takes a lot of practice, but my chances of success would be significantly lower because I didn't establish the second drawing first. I didn't have a maquette to draw on top of. So we had this really rough idea, and now what we have is a maquette, which is the mannequin, that structure, that little figure that you would see in a drawing store that has movable limbs. I basically just draw my own version of that, which is once again not reinventing the wheel. I'm just using a maquette to make sure that I have everything in place that needs to be in place. I'm pretty sure this is the second time I've drawn a dude with a suit and tie or a collared shirt in this course, but that's alright. One thing you want to look for as you're drawing and painting and creating art is recursion. I'm going to actually get rid of this just because I was starting to shade prematurely. But one thing you want to look for is recursion. Recursion being things that keep reoccurring, elements or principles, themes that keep following you in your work. And if they're mistakes, you want to start eliminating that kind of recursion. But if they're things like stylistic or thematic choices, then those are often things that become your affinities. So if, for example, you're always drawing lizards, that's something you probably want to follow because you have a higher chance of success in that endeavor than if you try to switch to robots and the robots aren't coming out great, you're not having fun drawing robots. It might just not be the time to draw robots. There's going to be plenty of time in your creative endeavors and your artistic attempts to learn new subject matter. Sometimes you have to look for what's recurring in your body of work and just build upon that. That's what a lot of your favorite artists, I'm willing to bet, you recognize certain things that keep popping up in their stuff. And the reason for that is because whether they know it or not, they're not afraid of keeping uh, keeping with recursion, keeping with their themes and what's working for them. When I first started drawing and painting, I would consistently just try to do everything. And when I'm doing everything, I'm really doing nothing. That's why there's a very good principle I learned about as I was reading a book one day. It was a business book, but it had this line that just struck me, and that's learn a lot about a little. And that bears repeating. So I'll probably just write that real quick. What you really want to do when you're trying to get good at something is you learn a lot about a little. And what that basically means is you keep practicing the same things over and over. There's a quote by Bruce Lee that I'm going to paraphrase because I don't know it word for word, and that's, I don't fear the man who has practiced 1,000 different kicks. I fear the man who has practiced one kick 1,000 different times. And that means that what that person has done is they've taken that one thing and they've, mastered it. They've really put their time in, and that's allowed them to excel. I suppose yet another way you could parse that is to think of it in terms of depth as opposed to breadth. Breadth being something that is very long but has no depth to it. It's not deep enough. You've never explored anything to the point where you're able to know it in and out. You have a surface level understanding. And if all we have is a surface level understanding in anything that we're trying to draw or create, then we are going to have a very difficult time breaching that. We need to go deeper. And that's why if you're going to focus on something, you should pick something like one value scale and just practice it for at least a week. Learn a lot about a little. Know all the things that that value scale has to divulge to you and your artistic growth. It's very difficult to stick with one thing until you develop the habit of it. But once you have the habit of going in and making sure that you're getting as deeply as you can in any given type of deliberate practice, you're going to see some results that will most likely surprise you. All right, so time to get clear on what kind of outfit this should be. I think I'm going to go for something a little sci-fi-ish. Yeah, let's adapt this into a more sci-fi design. Since we haven't done a lot with the outfit, we can still figure some of that out. One way I like to think about things that have more of a sci-fi basis, I mean, that's a pretty broad term, so we need to get even clearer on how we're going to do that. So I need to think of ways I can add shapes, elements, and designs to his attire in order to give it that feeling. And I would probably have to ask myself, well, what would he be doing in this kind of outfit? What would his role be? And this way I can have a clearer definition and my hand will follow that definition. So if I think of a job to give him, his haircut's fairly clean, the shirt, it seems like it would be more blue collar. He's probably not out there working on some sort of space dock. Maybe he could be a tech, some sort of person who works with the robotics division. Now, what would a tech wear? What kind of attire would somebody who works with the technology in a sci-fi universe kind of adorn their frame with? And now I have a little more certainty in regards to moving forward. I can think of shapes to lay on the frame now, on the figure. Probably give him some sort of cool apparatus for his arm. Something that would allow him to maybe program while he's walking, some sort of power glove. So then you get to thinking how that would fit and what sort of elements you could incorporate using what's established. Now, since I didn't have a previous idea of the design, it's going to take a little bit of drawing and erasing and figuring it out until I start to get a clearer idea on where that would kind of rest in terms of a gauntlet or tech apparatus. Alright, I think I've got a pretty good idea. So once again, notice the stopping when you're not quite sure. I can probably scale the head down a little bit. Even if he's a nerd, probably he's not going to have that big of a head. Oh, that's the face. Let's flatten these two layers right here. Alright, and we'll try that again. Just a little bit, make it a little more proportionate. Now I'll begin to introduce some more of these design elements. He could be an interstellar rogue, I suppose. It's not too far for that, although more of a technologically based one. And it's fun to kind of ruminate on these sort of things as you're creating, because it gives you a direction. It's in alignment with the overall vision for the image. So right now I'm just layering on some shapes, keeping my lines pretty succinct. Might go back and clean up a good portion of this, but for a demo it's fairly suitable. Down to the hand. Looks like we have a weird sort of joint happening there. Can't really ignore that. A little more bend at the elbow. Once again, we don't want things to seem stiff, and a lot of stiffness is going to arise from joints and how those are positioned. So you want to make sure that your joints, the joints of your figure, are placed in such a way that it doesn't feel hyperextended or overextended, and it's just bent ever so naturally. All right. Give him sort of a pocket here. Whatever you do to like keep some stuff in there. And maybe it's probably a button up of some sort. Think of like a flat space tie, maybe, if that's even possible. No, it's kind of cool to have a jacket, though. Let's rock a jacket. It'd be kind of a cool jacket. Sweet. So let's double check our list. Doing pretty good. Avoiding shaky, hairy, or fussy marks. Once you get to that point, it's best just to let them go. Start over again. Erase, redraw, erase, redraw. It's part of the game. Stiff and imbalanced poses. We already have a nice pose established, and we're making sure to bend the joints where appropriate. Go for a V-neck. Give them a couple more V's, though, so it's more of a chevron shape, which adds a sweet little detail amongst all this not detailed area. We want points where the eye can rest. Proportional placement issues, we've done pretty good to avoid those. We shrunk our head down a little bit. Might be neat to have some sort of symbol or element on the face that would give him more of a place in this universe that we are trying to get a glimpse into through this character. But for now, until I get an idea for that, I'm just going to keep on defining elements of the jacket. I'll probably still have zip-up jackets in space. He still looks a bit geeky, a bit tech. Practice fundamental shape drawing with these pockets. They're not too fussy. You don't want fussy pockets. All right. Let's do some shirt action where the shirt would end. It'll probably be like a belt. It's not out of the question. Draw the bottom of the jacket too. All right. Take a quick look. Can we add a little more flair? Maybe he could have some sort of scanner on his eye. Some other piece of technology that's hooked into his face. A visor? It's kind of interesting. See, at this point, it's more about the design. Once we have the other stuff established and we have enough information to work with, we can play a little more. The fundamentals are no longer what we need to solve. Not to the same degree anyway. Our pose is figured out, so now we're moving on to other considerations. And it doesn't mean you have to start with your pose figured out first. Once you get accustomed to drawing and figuring out all these elements that need to come into play, you can start doing it a little more naturally, a little more straightforward, and you'll start with an idea, maybe. You won't need to draw it over 3 times, although that certainly does help in many cases. Okay. What kind of pants? And this is a pretty fussy bit right here. I don't know if I'm digging that, because all this is nice and simple. Good, clear separation, even if I'm noodling on it a little bit. Whereas this seems like it doesn't quite know what it wants to be, so probably going to wipe a good portion of that. In most cases, it's best to opt for simplicity, especially in the details, if you don't know where you're going with something. Still trying to imagine what those forearm pieces would be like. You have to think, well, what would he be controlling? What sort of technology is he using? Is he just a worker? Is he a covert agent? once again, getting a little into design questions. We'll talk more about those and some of the latter aspects of this course. For now, probably just get some succinct shapes and be grateful for that, so we can get you to the assignment portion. Okay, so now the pants and the shoes and the arm, and then we'll add a little extra facial detailing, shade it, and call this one a wrap. It's always interesting to figure out how the bottom and the end of clothing is going to look, whether it's a shirt, pair of pants, what have you. Now I'm definitely seeing some of the issues with that leg. Probably be out even a little bit more, maybe. I can imagine the pants tapering, sort of skinny jeans-esque, having some folds at the bottom. Don't want to get too fussy with those. Most of the creases are going to be around the joints. Again, joints are great in terms of earmarks or benchmarks of where you're going to be adding certain details or places where stuff would bend. Seems to help quite a bit. Alright, it's definitely hyperextended. Let's try grabbing the joint, moving it back a little bit. It's a little more workable. Some pretty slick kicks, simple shoes. Even if I don't go exactly where my previous drawing was, I've gone over it enough times that it makes a good guidepost. And finally, I'm going to try and get the groin area right. Looking more right anyway. Flip it, check it. Still a little stiff. Probably got to move this one out a tad bit. Yeah, that helps a lot. Lower the opacity yet again. I'm going to figure out these hands. I guess it's a little bit anime-ish in the design. Like he would whip out some sort of projections from these gloves or gauntlets else fails, I usually go back to the most basic shapes and just kind of elaborate on those. I'm trying to avoid tangents, making sure that this looks like it's overlapping. I might try get a couple details in here, make them a little more interesting to look at. Know which aspects are overlapping. Horizontal bands are always good for detailing, in my experience. Even if it takes quite a few redrawings, the important thing is to get it looking good. Since we hadn't had a design in mind, I'm not too worried about it, just because it's mostly about the fundamentals and avoiding some of these things that we're presently paying attention to. And as long as we avoid those, then the mission that we set out to accomplish has been accomplished. It's getting a little fussy around the bottom of the pants. A little bit hairy and overlapping. Not too terribly though. Still very readable. Probably open this hand up. See the previous drawing, there was a proportional issue where it was a little longer than it should have been. Just go in and fix that in this version. Increase the size of the hand. Always on the watch for those proportional aspects. Yeah, so he's not super heroic, just has a pretty basic silhouette. Break up the shapes in an interesting way. Alright, we can start doing just a teeny bit of detailing. If it's a zipper, it means it's got a track. And the zipper itself, of course. He's got this apparatus that hooks into his ear and becomes kind of a visor. Add some other fingers. And we can pretty much call this one done as far as demonstration purposes go. It's still not super dynamic, but it's nowhere near as stiff as the first one. I'll do some dynamic poses in the later aspects of this course. Alright, get the fingers in there. And now we're going to do a bit of shading, so I can show you a two-tone value separation again. Make sure we are in alignment with our light source. But that's after I quickly kind of modify this here. After zooming out, the pose still looks a little stiff for my liking. So that hand looks like it's behind. This one can be above the figure. Still has to come down just a little bit. There we go. Can configure a pose for a hand. And you see there's a lot of that hairiness and uncertainty in here. Because again, the design wasn't sure. It wasn't set from the get-go. And even though we had most of the pose set up and the information was clearer, there's still always going to be things to fix with every iteration. So you basically stop when you've fixed and avoided as many of the things that we've inverted as possible. Trying to configure how that would play out. Let's see, maybe this, bend it up a little bit and back. Yeah, that's just not going to work as a silhouette. Which means it's probably going to need to be redrawn. I'll go ahead and do that quick. So one thing I really want to emphasize, as I have a couple times throughout the beginner drawing course, is that if something's not working and your medium doesn't prevent you from just getting rid of it and going over it, then by all means do so. Because it doesn't matter how much you've labored over a particular piece that isn't sitting well with the whole, if it's going to detract from the entire thing. If there's even one little bit of poison in the well, then the well is spoiled. All the water is spoiled. So definitely take the time to get rid of certain aspects and redo them, redraw them. And with digital, there's almost no excuse. Even, certain mediums like charcoal or other traditional mediums can be scraped or repainted. It's just going to have to happen. And in this case, there were some items that I saw after I took a break that I really thought could use some redrawing and repurposing. So I came back and I'm speeding up the video just by 2 times now, just because I don't really have that much to say other than I was going in and fixing some elements based on my checklist there, and just adding a little bit more interest to the character design, thinking, what is the actual purpose behind it? Because one thing that I actually realized during the creation of this particular image was that a lot of a lot of art is going to be having purpose and having your decisions made ahead of time before you start laying in marks and actually drawing. You might take 2 hours to really think and write down some ideas or do some thumbnail sketches because you're going to have to figure things out regardless. And if you figure them out ahead of time, then it's going to be just way easier and you're going to have to do less of this redrawing business. Not saying that redrawing is a bad thing, but when you plan prior, then you have more clarity and thus your chances of success are higher. So it's kind of the 80-20 rule where 20% of the time you spend planning makes the whole 80% go by a lot easier. Basically what I did was I just got rid of those arms because I think those were the biggest thing kind of holding back the drawing and the interest level. I wanted more of like a crazy kind of bioorganic robot plated arm, and the other one's just kind of chilling in the pocket. And I'm making some quick adjustments to the face, adding a little bit more detailing, refining the outer contours and lines. No matter what kind of design you're doing, if there's a face in it, you should really take the time to make sure that you get that looking pretty solid. And I'm just going around the edges to also contour some of those other elements and items. But yeah, if you're working on the face, you want to make sure that that looks solid, because if the face is goofy, the whole thing is going to get thrown off. So, and faces are hard enough to draw in and of themselves, but when you're adding a whole design around it, that can be even more taxing to figure out. But it's a necessary thing. So just have fun with it, but also be sure to get it as correct as you can, as believable, if you will. Like I just lassoed the whole thing and moved it up a little bit because it was a little too downward, a little too close to the jaw, not as aesthetic or reading as I would have liked it to read. Yeah, really the purpose behind having these different sweeps of cleanup and tweaking is because you're going to find elements that need to be run over a couple times. And since this is the basically the third version of the drawing, I'm just now getting that level of clarity that's permitting me to access levels of finish that before weren't available to me during the creative process. And you'll find that the iterations really do help. But again, if you don't want to have as many iterations, then just plan a little bit up front. It's your call, essentially, at that point. I'm just going in and eliminating some tangents here, adding a little details, because those were some pretty plain leg shapes. And I'm also mirroring the design, meaning that you can see those studs on the end of the gauntlet. I put those down by the pants as well, so we have some shape repetition, which is a good design principle. But yeah, this about wraps it up for this particular demonstration about inverting the problems in order to solve them. And we're going to move on to the assignment portion now. So let's talk a little bit about that. Okay, so assignment for week 9. First and foremost, I want you to write down 3 to 5 things you want to avoid in your drawings. So these could be things like noodling, tangents, or too many hairy, superfluous marks, kind of the things that I showed you during this video, or things that you've noticed that keep cropping up in your work, such as very stiff poses, or you keep hiding the hands. Those are the kind of things I want you to write down, things you want to avoid doing. So basically, you want to take the elements in your work, probably the biggest ones that are bothering you, preferably, and you want to write them down and keep a checklist with you. And the next portion is to spend at least 1 to 2 focused hours each day eliminating poor drawing habits using your list. So again, these could be the things that I presented to you in this video, or the things that you notice yourself are not getting into the work that should be getting into the work, or making it into the work and shouldn't be in the work, like too many lines, etc. So remember that what you don't do has just as much power as the things that you actually do. So if you're adding way too many marks, then that is going to take down the quality of the work in a very powerful way. And that power that could be bringing the work upward is used for the wrong purpose. It's like turning an energy source into a weapon, you know? So remember that if you leave some things out, or if you stop doing certain things, you weed out these bad habits, then you will have that power available to you to work your drawings up to a new level, and you will see growth in your art and growth in your expression as a creative. You can do figure drawings, photo studies, or practice from any kind of reference. So that could be other artists who you really admire. It doesn't really matter. The point of this exercise is just to write down those 3 to 5 things and then spend 1 to 2 very focused hours every day eliminating those habits. So you're inverting the problem. You're figuring out the things you're not going to do anymore. So don't beat yourself up if you do them. Just correct it. If you have to start all the way over, that's fine. Just make a new drawing with the other one right by you and say, these are the things I'm going to avoid. And then even if you avoid them by 10%, more than last time, then you're on the right track. If you want to draw from imagination, that's fine too. So that's your assignment for week 9, guys. I really appreciate you making it this far and watching this video. Hopefully you're already enjoying the extended edition of the beginner drawing course and is having as much fun learning and drawing and creating as I am, making this for you. So again, this is your assignment this week. Try to spend at least 1 to 2 focused hours just on this alone, and I will see you in week 10, where we will be covering some even more fun stuff that's a little more advanced than what we had covered the previous 8 weeks. All right, thanks again, happy drawing, and I'll see you in the next video.